The old ghost town of Milparinka, just over the South Australian border in New South Wales. In the 1880s, it was home to a mini gold rush of sorts. But today the town and its nearby waterhole are major stopping off points on a trail following the footsteps of one of the nation's greatest explorers. It was here on January the 27th, 1845, that Captain Charles Sturt and his party, carrying a whaleboat of all things, arrived in desperate need of rest. By the time Sturt and his men get here, they're in a bad way. But this is their salvation, water, at a place Sturt called Depot Glen. They would camp by this spring-fed waterhole for 6 months. After little more than 3, Sturt wrote, "Our hair, as well as the wool on the sheep, has ceased to grow. So great is the heat, we were obliged to bury our candles." Scurvy had taken hold of the men, and finally, on July 16, 1845, Sturt's deputy, James Poole, died. Little did Sturt realise that the cairn he had his men build during their long drought-enforced stay would become a monument to his loyal companion. He would later write in his journal, "That rude structure looks over his lonely grave and will stand for ages as a record of all we suffered in the dreary region to which we were so long confined." Poole's cairn, or Poole's monument as it's known, was one of Sturt's work programs for the men. It was designed to motivate them, to keep their spirits up while they were stuck down at Depot Glen. But one can't help but wonder whether they praised him or cursed him. One suspects the latter. In July 1845, rain began to fall and Sturt broke camp. He sent 9 men from here back to Adelaide and pressed on with the rest of his party, determined to make it into the very centre of the continent in the hope of finding his inland sea. For his final push into the heart of Australia, Sturt headed northwest, eventually reaching the shores of what was then a dry lake. This is Lake Pinaroo, and as you can see, it's no inland sea. And it certainly didn't look like this when Captain Charles Sturt came through. He hit this place in the midst of a chronic drought. John Cappy of Tri-State Safaris and I arrived after good rains. In such an environment, it's hard to imagine what Sturt and his men were up against. Like so much of the interior, this part of corner country flourishes following a decent downpour. For the budgies, it's a cue for breeding. These delightful creatures put on quite a show, and come in the right season, much of the country bursts into life.
This is the ruby saltbush, Ron, and these little berries, beautiful eating, very much like an apple. If you, quite tasty, aren't they?
They're beautiful.
They're beautiful.
Which begs the question, I mean, Paul gets scurvy,
But,
and yet there's so much bush tuck around.
Yes, I guess being Europeans and not knowing a lot of Australia bush tucker, they weren't going to eat anything in case of getting crook.
It was near here that Sturt set up his base for his last foray into the interior. John Cappy has brought many a Sturt enthusiast into the national park named after the first European to set foot here.
When he came through here, it was, virgin land. Never been trodden on by white man ever before.
From Fort Grey on the shores of Lake Pinaroo, Sturt and 3 other men crossed over into South Australia, stopping at a waterway which cuts through several deserts. Sturt named it Cooper Creek, after Sir Charles Cooper, the Chief Justice back in Adelaide. The party pushed on even further into featureless terrain, in temperatures that caused the men's thermometers to burst. It was a lonely, desolate and dangerous journey as the explorer and his party pushed on, reaching a wilderness they named Sturt's Stony Desert. Sturt often spoke in nautical terms when describing his journey. In fact, he wrote, "We were as lonely as a ship at sea, and as any navigator seeking for land. Only we had the disadvantage of an unsteady compass without any fixed point on which to steer." By this stage of the journey, Sturt was suffering from sun blindness. The intense glare, a feature of his journeys up and down the River Murray and into the interior, was taking its toll. But still the men pressed on until they reached the Simpson Desert, where they were faced with sand ridges 30 metres high. Just 240 kilometres from the centre of Australia, Captain Charles Sturt finally conceded defeat and turned back to Fort Grey and later to Adelaide, some 2 years after his initial departure. While not having discovered an inland sea, this dramatic and heroic journey opened up much of inland Australia for pastoralism, a feature of corner country to this very day. Tri-state safaris run regular trips into the border country of South Australia, New South Wales and Queensland, and along the way call into many of the sites made famous through Sturt's amazing exploits. To book a tour, contact Tri-State on 8088 2389.